12 Against the Gods by William Bolitho. Chapter 4. Mahomet. Geography, as Columbus has explained, is adventure's domain, where any with a gun may hope for sport in the season. But in her less accessible domains, the deserts and forests of the spirit, there are the tracks of big game for the boldest hunters. The religious adventurer does not often fill his bag, but he has camped out with mystery. He deserves listeners, even if he never won disciples. The greatest of them have been further than Columbus, further than Sir John de Mandeville or Lemuel Gulliver. They have made the grand Dante circuit of heaven and hell. They have lived on this little earth like an island, and made up their night fires to scare away the noises of the interstellar dark. There was one of these, who throughout his supernatural expedition kept quite sane, and even a little stupid, which is the quality of robust sanity, so that his whole route and what happened to him is clear and dramatic. This was the celebrated Mahomet, who sealed his letters to the emperors of the world. Mahomet, apostle of God. He was at the beginning a poor relation of a powerful family, who lived in the decaying caravan town of Mecca, on the high road through the suburbs of the old world Arabia. The modern literary Arabia is a paradise of passion, liberty, and dates, but in the year of Mahomet's birth, AD 570, the situation was less enticing. It seemed that after a remarkable historical burst, the destiny of the Semite people who inhabited it was ended, and that the whole race, in its varieties of Jew, Babylonian, and Ishmaelite, or Arab, was doomed to the vegetative obscurity of mere Bedouinism, from which only its strategic geography, on the intersection of the great land routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa, and remarkable talents for ecstatic poetry, had for many brilliant centuries lifted it. All that remained of the magnificence of Babylon was a horde of bandits, the Al-Hira, who gave a sort of blackleg service to the power of Persia. In the Syrian north, they served Byzantium and a large variety of Christian trinities. The Jews, after their ferocious and horrible resistance to the conquest of Titus, had partly trekked to the south in compact, sullen tribes, or embarked for their vast European adventure. There were small, strong kingdoms of them round all the major oases of the desert, as far as the Yemen, the happy Arabia of the ancients, where everything the luxury of Europe desired grew in abundance. They were especially numerous along the great road that flanked the impassable steppe of the interior, along between the mountains and the Red Sea. The rest of the inhabitants, the Arabs proper, had in those days no prestige. Part of them lived at the depots and halts of the route, and engaged, as we shall see, partly in lodging, feeding, and robbing the travellers who passed, partly in the diminishing transport industry by convoying the caravans between Damascus and Aden. The rest, when they had the chance, shared in this work, or starved in their tents, or when their inveterate inter-tribal wars permitted, formed bands and held up the highroads. Arabia, therefore, as a whole, as far as it concerns us, that is, excluding the fertile Yemen, lived on the transcontinental road traffic. But this was steadily degenerating, ever since a cool and thoughtful Ptolemy, Greek pharaoh of Egypt, tired of the robbery and murder of his merchants, invented a sea service to Abyssinia and India, which was gradually throttling its expensive rival, the Arab land route. So, in the time of Mahomet, the rich caravan cities of the north were fallen into abandonment and ruin. Petra, Jerash, and Philadelphia. Medina and Mecca, the latter the halfway house between Arabia Felix and Arabia Petrea, the lucky Arabia of the south, and the stony Arabia of the north, still struggled for a living. This Mecca was a town of some thousands of citizens, situated in a critical pass of the mountain wall by which Arabia abuts on the Red Sea. The whole region is salt and barren. Even the date palm, the only plant that can endure both freezing and scorching, will not grow there. After all these years, that the riches of 3 continents have poured ceaselessly into this wretched place, there are no gardens, and a stunted bush is a civic pride. The component reasons for the existence of Mecca were, first, the trade road, the incense route, a well of tepid water, the holy Zemzem, a fair for camel leather and slaves, and the Kaaba. No one can see which was first. Immemorially, a meteor fell in this valley. It is a reddish-black stone, semicircular, 6 inches high, 8 broad, today polished with myriads of kisses, but still showing on its surface the molten wrinkles which appeared to its first worshippers, a name and a message in the unknown script of the gods of the sky who threw it down. Perhaps before Alexander or even Ramesses, this black stone had been found and reverently built into the corner of a cubic temple, the Kaaba or cube, and those who came to the fair worshipped it, or its worshippers held a fair, which first no one can say. Such sacred stones were not rare in Arabia, but the black stone had a certain preeminence. Connoisseurs in idolatry made long journeys to see it. This cube is the center of Mahomet's adventure. Naturally, since no Arab can make a right angle, it was then, and is today in its reconstruction, crooked on the splay. About 40 feet high, long and broad, with a door that has always been a tall man's height above the ground, and only to be reached with a ladder, perhaps because of the floods, which are an annual plague of the place. In Mahomet's time, this Kaaba was furnished inside with images. The biggest was the idol Hobal, who stood on a pit where the treasures of the cult were stored. Another idol, or more probably another name for this Hobal, was Al-Lat, or Allah. A few cubits from this cube was the well Zemzem. Its water is brackish and lukewarm. Mahomet's grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, rediscovered it and found in it 2 golden gazelles and several complete suits of armor that had been buried there by the antique dynasty of Jurhum, who had walled all up in a defeat hundreds of years before. This Abd al-Muttalib was the head of his clan, and an important personage in the whole Quraysh, the tribe who mainly owned and held the town. 8 years before his death, the affairs of Mecca went through a catastrophe. The Black King of Abyssinia, then as now a Christian, was incited by the Emperor of Byzantium, his co-religionist, to avenge some persecution of missionaries, probably by a Jewish tribe, and sent an expedition, in which was a war elephant, to destroy Hobal, Al-Lat the Cube, the Black Stone and Mecca. In the passes of the mountains, an epidemic of smallpox came on his army, who turned back. This is the War of the Elephant, an essential element of the Mahometan legend, and resulted in an increase of the reputation of the old shrine, with a spurt in the declining fortunes of the tourist industry of the town. Abd al-Muttalib, as the discoverer of Zemzem, shared largely in these, for he and his family enjoyed the revenue of the supply of holy water, and also it appears of some sort of monopoly of the catering to the pilgrims. In these circumstances, Mahomet was born. His father Abdullah died while he was in arms, leaving no fortune. But Abd al-Muttalib spared enough from the budget of his huge family to put the baby out to wet nurse among a friendly tribe of Bedouin in the vicinity. The legends about his boyhood are neither credible nor interesting. He looked after the goats, and from time to time had some sort of epileptic fits. When he was old enough, he returned to Mecca. His mother was dead. His grandfather, Abd al-Muttalib, soon followed, confiding young Mahomet to the care of 2 uncles, one poor and noble, Abu Talib, one rich and dull, Al-Abbas. The former took the youngster with him in a caravan to Damascus, which journey no doubt had an educative influence, but ended in financial loss. These men of Mecca had no developed form of government. The richest or most ferocious among them, no doubt, had some sort of personal precedence in the civic debates, in which all the tribesmen had a right to be present. They were still regulated by that curious and archaic institution of the vendetta, without some insight into which Mahomet's ascendant career will be difficult to understand. In our own days, its survival among the Italians, the Corsicans, and other backward races seems the very definition of civil disorder. But in its youth, it was, on the contrary, an embryonic policy, without which, in the absence of any other system of order, life among peoples with the temperaments of Arabs or Anglo-Saxons, for we too seem to have begun with it, would be impossible even for professional bandits. The substitution of the term of corporate revenge perhaps makes this easier to see. Mecca was occupied by two tribes, the Khozar and the Quraysh. Mahomet was a Qurayshite. Each of these tribes was in turn made up of families or clans. The most important in Quraysh were the Hashemites and the Umayyads, closely related and impassably separated by blood and history. Mahomet was a Hashemite. His grandfather, the holy caterer, Abd al-Muttalib, had been its head. Every native of the town was a member of one of these factious families or owned by one of them as a slave. In every individual's misdeeds or wrongs, his family were implicated by tradition, custom, and that strongest of all motives for a fight, self-respect, or vanity. Thus there were two checks on murderous and thievish instincts, one the positive fear of skin vengeance to the third and fourth generation, the other, the restraint, often itself violent, of his fellow clansmen against any act that would be revenged on them indiscriminately, as well as on its doer. Social life in old Mecca, therefore, might be likened to that of the bootlegging world of Chicago. Characters, tastes, and occupations have a certain impudent resemblance. But the Meccan experience was wider and bitterer, very likely, so that life there stepped cautiously, and even politeness was not unknown. But underneath this pleasing resultant of countless feuds, the old inviolability of vendetta remained. No reason could hold off its assistance to a clan member if he was attacked, and Mahomet in the years of his unpopularity had his clan behind him. Unbelievers though most of them were. On top of this law of disorder, hard times had laid the beginnings of another peace. After all, the Meccans lived more and more on pilgrims as the caravan traffic declined, and even an Arab idolater hated to find himself disturbed in his prayers at the Kaaba by some murderous riot that marked another stage in a local quarrel in which he was not concerned. Donnybrook never attracted a good class of tourists. After centuries of discussion, the Meccans, under the leadership of the Quraysh, had agreed and advertised that for 4 months in the year there should be a sacred peace in the town and its suburbs, during which no weapon might be carried, a moratorium of vendetta. These holy months were at first timed to coincide with the fair, that is, autumn, when the date crop was in and food was cheap. But owing to the imperfection of the lunar calendar, this coincidence gradually split, until, to the baffled dismay of the Meccan people, they saw the holy months each year falling later. In the time of Mahomet, they fell in high summer, when even water was scarce. The first public event in Mahomet's life was a breach of this annual truce, known to Quranists as the sacrilegious war. It fell in his 20th year. A creditor of one of the Quraysh took a monkey to the fair, seated himself in a prominent place. He began shouting, "Who will give me such another ape, and I will give him my claim on such a one?" Naming his debtor one of the Quraysh with his full pedigree and many picturesque and poetical comments. A Qurayshite brave came up and lopped off the animal's head. Everyone rushed to arms or to safety, and the row continued far into the night. That year, the holy months were as busy as a ghetto on a Sunday. There were even pitched battles, in one of which Mahomet took place. He refers to his share without much enthusiasm. He was never a fighting man. "I remember," said the prophet, "being present with my uncles in the sacrilegious war. I discharged some arrows at the enemy, and I do not regret it." This affair undid most of the good that came from the advertisement of the victory of the elephant. Business was bad in Mecca for 20 years after. Meanwhile, young Mahomet went into store as a salesman of agricultural produce. His condition did not satisfy him. When he received an offer of marriage from a rich widow who had employed him in a caravan expedition as a driver, he accepted eagerly. This was Khadija, daughter of Khuwaylid. She was 40 years old and had been twice married. Mahomet was 25 years old. Though there was never any portrait of the Prophet, the minutest peculiarities of his appearance have been piously preserved by the faithful. He was a small man, but he caught the eye. Usually he was taciturn, and more subject to fits of abstraction when he heard or saw nothing. But he could be agreeable, rather boisterous company. When he spoke, he turned his whole body, and not only his head. When he laughed, which was not seldom, he opened his huge mouth, like a crocodile, so that his gums and all his teeth were visible, and his eyes disappeared. These were piercing but bloodshot. He used to paint his eyelashes with kohl and antimony to make them appear more lustrous. He dyed his beard, some say red, some yellow, and was fond of loudly coloured linen clothes.
Though he abhorred silk, which was invented so that women could go naked in clothes, he had a great shout. Both his anger and his mirth were explosive. He had a curious gait, very important, as if he was descending a steep and invisible hill. He now lived in a storied house, in the notable quarter, overlooking the central square, and the Kaaba, and the well Zemzem. The sudden change in his circumstances from a counterhand to the leisured husband of a capitalist, which made his company tolerated in the groups of leaders when they discussed town affairs, first made him compare, and then think. Those who underestimate the almost infallible effects of such a change on a meditative mind, working like an enforced induction, may believe the story that a single curious event, occurring at this time, changed Mahomet noun into Mahomet verb. The old Kaaba, after a severe flood, began to fall in ruins. The notables decided to risk the high-tension taboo on its substance and rebuild it. One Walid had the courage to be the first to touch the holy wall. He seized a pickaxe, gave one stroke, then fled. All retired from the place until next morning to see if anything happened to him. When they found he was still alive, the work proceeded. But at the end, when it came to the question of resealing the black stone, there was a bad dispute, all the clans claiming the honor for themselves. Finally, they agreed to abide by the decision of the first man to appear in the square. This chanced to be Mahomet. He delivered his judgment very nicely. First, he took off his mantle and spread it on the ground. On this, he placed the stone and kissed it. Then he asked a chief to come forward from each of the 4 chief clans, each to take a corner and lift it to the proper height. Mahomet himself guided it into place. However it happened, by the natural mechanism of circumstance or by some such faltering hazard, Mahomet began then to think about the town's affairs, to worry about the decline of the pilgrimage and its causes, to hang on the groups of local leaders who discussed remedies in informal parliament on the stony street corners, or sheltered against the wind under the lee of the Kaaba itself. The start of Mahomet's adventure, or in its more usual synonym, the basis of the Mohammedan religion, is this preoccupation of his with the fortunes of his native town. Squeamish pedantry may object to the triviality of the phrase, which fits nevertheless with a precision no other can give. Mahomet was a hometown booster, and this conception will unlock the many obscurities of his life and his doctrine, which the most subtle theological speculations and the most careful minutiae of history are incapable of coping with. The door by which he enters is, how can we attract the whole world, at least the whole of Arabia, yearly to the Kaaba? And the vision of one God, greatest common denominator of religion, is the solution, not the prime inspiration. In fact, Mohammedanism is a religion, because Mecca's problem, as a pilgrimage town, was religious. The rhapsodies, the epilepsies of the man while he is still struggling towards his invention, are the symptoms of a process which they sometimes assist and sometimes retard. If they were taken as analogous to the painful mental strainings
of a Rotarian enthusiast racking his brain for a world-beating slogan for the town of his heart. It might be irreverent. We regretfully forswore reverence at the beginning of these studies, but it would not be a joke, nor a mistake. So Mahomet embarked on the most dangerous enterprise in the world, the foundation of a religion, with common sense, a common sense so rigid and unfanciful that it approached arithmetic. Columbus had, at any rate, 3 seaworthy brigs. Mahomet adventures into the realm of passion, dream, nightmare, on the rule of 3. He began to walk alone, to beat the air with his hands, to sweat over secret thoughts, over a plan, which at nights he would confide to the buxom sympathy of Khadijah, by which, at the expense of a certain percentage, perhaps of the Bedouin idolaters, often so poor that their patronage was not really worthwhile, he would attract to the Kaaba rich millions of Jews and whole congregations of the Christians he had seen in Syria, fish from the boundless ocean of Rome and New Rome. For 10 years before he ventured to say a word in public, he told Khadijah about it. First, was not the legend that Mecca was founded by Abraham? That Hagar, his maid-servant flying from the wrath of his wife Sarah, with Ishmael his son, drank and discovered this well Zemzem? These, said Mahomet, are the true beginnings of Mecca, and Mecca will prosper by them as the forefathers who kept the story never dreamed. For both Christians and Jews reverence Abraham, but they will never visit his temple and the cradle of his son if the absurd, unarithmetical, childish and wicked worship of an indeterminate number of gods continues in Mecca. All the educated peoples I have seen, Jews and Christians, he would go on, recognize the obvious fact that there is but one God. Hobal and his college of demonic friends must go. There is no God but Allah, and Mahomet is his prophet. In the elaboration of his great plan, he became more and more absorbed. The noise of the town worried him. He was always afraid of noise, thunder or traffic or war. So he betook himself for long days to the sterile, windy hills round the town, especially to Mount Hira, a sugar cone eminence 3 miles from Mecca, where Khadijah accompanied him. When he was in town, he would frequent Jews, who were numerous there, and talk, and also ask questions from Zaid, his servant and friend, a short dark man with a depressed nose who had been a slave among Christians, who told him what he remembered of the doctrine. Mahomet understood the Jewish theology better, its dietetic and medical commandments, and he was above all struck with its expectation of the Messiah. The Christians, too, as far as Zaid's confused recollections of the tangled teaching of the heretical Syrian family who had owned him went, were also expecting some prophet, the Paraclete, which garbled into Periklutos, translated very fairly into Arabic, Ahmed, the praised, a version of Mahomet's own name. These promptings, even if nature had omitted to implant ambition in him, would have infallibly brought into Mahomet's simple schematizing the idea of leadership, personal leadership. The idea of religion encloses priest as inevitably as God. Put into Mahomet's own style, Mecca needed one prophet as well as one God. When the embryo was at this stage, his exasperation of hard thinking found its outlet in poetry. The poetry of the earliest surahs of the Quran, which are such a striking contrast to the platitudinous prose that too abundantly followed when the intellectual tension was over. Indeed, in the form itself of these curious and magnificent productions, there is a revelation of the man, which dispenses from further detailing. His terrible auto-excitation to thought, which almost burst the veins in his forehead, in the curious elemental oath formula which begins them, and the mediocre restatement of the Hebrew or Christian ethical doctrine beyond which, with all this effort, he rarely arrives. Thus, Surah 100. The chapters of the Quran are higgledy-piggledy. By the roaring, panting steeds, striking fire flashes with the hoof that scour the land at dawn, darken it with their dust, split apart the enemy. Verily, man is to his Lord ungrateful. Verily he is keen after this world's good. Or Surah 91, to admire the full effect of which it is necessary to know that in the original each verse ends in a panting ha, pronoun third person, as indicated by the italics. By the sun and his rising splendor, by the moon when she follows him, by the day when it sets out his glory, by the night when it covers him in darkness, by the heavens and him that made them, by the earth and the soul. Verily he that purifies them is blessed, and the contrary is he that corrupts them. Then sooner or later he arrives at the awe-inspiring novelty of the day of judgment. The Semites seem to have been slow to bethink themselves of this natural corollary of the concept of divine justice. The mention of life after death itself, of course, is notably rare in the Old Testament, though the rabbinical schools of Mahomet's time were obsessed with it, and probably the worshippers of Hoba knew no more about it than the contemporaries of Moses or Homer. There is no reason except sentiment to believe that Mahomet came upon this potent doctrine in any different way from the rest of his borrowed ethics. But once the premonition of the immensity of the notion, which was destined to support the edifice of Mohammedanism, like the green basalt at the base of the Kaaba, began to work on him, we are enriched with one of the most rare and astonishing of the surahs, a hymn in which we can hear the cracking of the sinews of his thinking. Surah 101. That which strikes. What is that which strikes? And what shall certify thee what the striking is? The day mankind shall be scattered like moths, and the mountains carded like coloured wool. Then as for him whose balances are heavy, he shall enter into bliss. And as for him whose balances are light, the pit shall be his dwelling. And what shall certify thee what is the pit? A raging fire. In spite of the support of his audience wife, such efforts began to overwhelm him. The angel Gabriel began to appear and confide a vast and discoordinated amount of Jewish legend, Christian heresy, proverbial common sense, and philosophical history of the Quraysh. The prophet himself imagined, after all, it might be a devil. Khadijah reassured him. The next time the voice in his head spoke to him, they were together in her room, and he gave her as arranged a signal. She pulled off her chemise, and taking him on her knees, began to caress him in a very intimate manner. The voice stopped. See, says Khadijah, a lewd or wicked spirit would have remained. As it is, it must have been Gabriel. From this point, the religion is ripe to be preached, and henceforth Mahomet prefaces every surah with the word say or speak to mark its status. Thus in Surah 112, the theological, though certainly not historical, starting point of Mohammedanism, say, He is God alone, God the Eternal, He begetteth not, nor He is begotten, and there is not any like Him. Nothing remained but the practical, to present his religion to Mecca, clear out the idols from the Kaaba, announce the changed management to the Christians and Jews, and amass the results. Mecca would again know palmy days, and under the beneficent rule of its benefactor, itself, proceed to enjoy its prosperity in peace and order. As for that positive hindrance to this prosperity of the vendetta brawling, that would be settled by the teaching of the new system, that all believers were brethren and forbidden to injure one another. This offer of Mahomet to Mecca is the great offer of all adventurers to society, to exchange all that is loved, owned, established for a dream, with the leadership of the candid outsider thrown in. Brass lamps for gold. The kingdom of the world if you will fall down and worship me. All the folklore trade of sorcerers and devils. To the people he proposed, burn the gods of your fathers and your children. To the privileged, give up your offices and be one of the crowd again. To the clan that was just getting the score right with their hereditary enemies after 50 years' loss, throw in your winning hand. To the potentates of the town, obey, as you never have obeyed any man, this little bloodshot fellow, the exploiter of a fond widow's fortune. The offer is invariable, so is society's answer, first laughter and then curses. Mahomet is now 44 years old.
His first converts are remembered by name in the prayers of hundreds of millions today. They are Khadijah, who tested the angel; Zayd, who had been a Christian slave; Ali, the Prophet's cousin, son of good down-at-the-heels Abu Talib; Waraka, poor, toothless cousin; and Abu Bakr, who afterwards became the first caliph of Islam, a thin, weedy man with a bulging forehead. He was a business friend of Khadijah and had a moderate fortune which he spent in the cause. This Abu Bakr brought in the first outside converts. They have become saints, but to the unbeliever seem of poor quality, slaves, boys, women. Except one Bilal, an Abyssinian Negro with a mighty baritone voice. We will see what a curious destiny awaited this gift. In the first 4 years, there were about 40 converts, mostly slaves, few among the Quraysh or among Mahomet's own clan at all, so that already Islam jumped over the tribal divisions of Mecca and tended to throw some confusion into the politics of the town. At first, his opponents contented themselves with laughter. Mahomet for years was a good joke to the loungers in the hot evenings round the Kaaba. But gradually, irritation grew at the attitude of his slave followers to their master's gods, and there were many beatings, and when these were not enough, condemnation to the stocks which in Mecca were placed in the sun, and included the pain of thirst from sunrise to sundown. The only one who did not recant under this treatment was Bilal, the Negro, who shouted all day, "Ahad, Ahad." 1. A neat and practical summary of the simplicity of the new religion for such circumstances. Abu Bakr bought him from his idolatrous master and set him free. In these circumstances, Mahomet began to have a rapid series of revelations, very encouraging to the dispirited sect. Surah 15, a unique possession of this religion of common sense, came to the rescue of the demi-martyrs. Whoever denies Allah after that, he has believed, excepting him who is forcibly compelled thereto, his heart remaining steadfast in the faith. On such rests the wrath of Allah. The gloss of the traditionalists on this passage leaves no room for doubt. Mahomet one day passed a certain slave named Ammar, who was sobbing and groaning, and inquired the reason. "They would not let me go, O Prophet, until I had abused thee and spoken well of their gods," says Ammar. Mahomet, "But how is thy heart?" "Steadfast in the faith." "Then," said the sagest of prophets, "if they repeat their beatings, repeat thou also their recantation." In addition to this valuable dispensation, the faithful were cheered with a new motive for perseverance. Hitherto, they had been drilled by the fear of hell. Now they heard news of paradise. Gabriel brought the good news of Surah 78. "Verily for the pious is a blissful abode, gardens and vineyards, damsels with swelling breasts of suitable age, and a brimming cup. This wine, forbidden in this world, is later described as sealed with musk and spiced with ginger. And then there is luscious Surah 5. Besides these, there shall be 2 gardens, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny, of a dark green, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny. In each, 2 fountains of welling water, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny. In each, fruit, dates and pomegranates, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny. In them, women, smooth, lovely, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny. Black-eyed damsels kept in pavilions, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny, whom no man has yet enjoyed, nor even a jinn, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny. The believers shall lie with them on green rugs, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny. And lovely soft carpets, which then of the signs of the Lord will ye deny. It is not recorded that there were any more recantations after the revelation of Surah 5. With it and the daily prayer, Surah 1, made famous by thousands of European novelists and dramatists as the distinctive local colour of the warm East, the elements of Islam are complete. Praise be to Allah, the Lord of creation. the merciful, the compassionate, ruler of the day of judgment. Help us, lead us in the path of those to whom thou hast made promises, not of those you are angry with who walk in error.
Mahomet himself, Abu Bakr, and all the free citizens of Mecca who joined him were subject to nothing but the most guarded abuse, being protected by the very institution of vendetta they desired to abolish. The words of one Hisham, a prominent gangman and inveterate idolater, are recorded when it was proposed in his presence to suppress Islam by force. "Beware if you kill one of my tribe," he answered, "for I shall be obliged to slay in his stead the chiefest among you." The opposition in this deadlock took the form of muttered abuse and a rather easy accusation of plagiarism against the Prophet. "He gets all his stuff from the Jews, and Zayd, the ex-Christian," was the commonest taunt, to which Mahomet only made the weak reply, "How could a foreigner, Jew or Christian, tell me these things, since they are in pure Arabic?" Unnecessarily weak, for while Mahomet's borrowings from Christianity are many, they are so distorted that they must have passed through at least 3 misunderstandings. Mahomet's miscomprehension of what some mistaken informant told him of the confused ideas of some monophysite heretic who had not quite grasped the teachings of his own sect. Surely, in the circumstances, this may count as an original revelation. As for his much wider borrowings from Judaism, even reckoning that his source was late Talmudic legend and not the originals, he has given them such a fanciful, ingeniously imaginative twist, that here too, the harsh word plagiarism is unjust. Thus there are pages, volumes almost, in the Quran of such tales as these, that Mount Sinai was suddenly raised in the air and held threateningly over the heads of the Israelites to make them accept the law, that the mountains where David was walking joined with a sublime bass in his songs, that Jews who broke the Sabbath were suddenly changed into red apes, that Ezra was raised from the dead after 100 years, still sitting on his ass.
But the problem of the slave converts, and of those strangers who were also unprotected by the vendetta system, remained unsettled, since both Khadija's and Abu Bakr's funds began to diminish by the exorbitant price asked for them by their persecuting masters. A certain emigration of these began towards the Christian Negro kingdom of Abyssinia. This is called the First Flight. It was encouraged by Mahomet, who was now nearing the age of 50 and growing tired, as the increased prosiness and platitude of his revelations show. These first fugitives included the fanatics, who felt the burden of living near an idolatrous shrine intolerable, and Mahomet saw them go with relief. The adventure weighed on him. He had reasons to believe he could bring it to a happy end, in which all or most of the advantages that had lured him to undertake it could be obtained. The chiefs of the town had allowed him to see that an arrangement was possible. On a certain day after the refugees had gone, he came to the Kaaba, found there, as if by accident, all the chiefs assembled, and squatting beside him, he began to recite in his loud sing-song, "I saw Gabriel another time, by the tree at the furthest boundary, near which is the restful paradise. I did not look aside, and I saw some of the finest wonders of the Lord." Then he went on. I asked, "What think you of Al-Lat and Al-Uzza and Manat also?" These last 2 were the females in the Kaaba College of Gods. Gabriel answered, "These are exalted females whose intercession is certainly to be sought after." All Quraysh stood up and cheered him, and bowed down and worshipped. The automobile trajectory of Mahomet then brought him safely to that great bourne of all common sense, compromise. This happy, reasonable scene under the Kaaba wall, out of the wind, is as far as Mahomet may be projected by his own power. The town booster, the ingenious planner of a nationwide Come to Mecca slogan, has decided to liquidate and distribute himself. The bonus years of the effort of thinking and unpopularity had won for him. He signals the gods of adventure to stop and let him get down. This is, in fact, the fatal turning point to which in turn we have watched with anxiety
his predecessors arrive, when the retreat from adventure begins. In every case we have yet examined, the wreck that follows has been caused from within their own characters, a rupture of the motor, a shift of balance between want and have, that has toppled them to ignominy, misery, derision. Had he been travelling in mere geography, or mere history, no doubt his story would slide here into the monotonous, and he lived unhappily ever after, of the rest. A few months' popularity, a few years' influence, then this obscure municipal theorizer would have been bustled off the stage, perhaps by some ironical backworking of the vendetta principle, his bodily safe till now, which he had done his best in the ascending days to destroy. But however dumpy his personality, this merchant of the supernatural has dealt with the night. He has dabbled in the immense and chartless seas in the depth of the human heart, and in this hour there is no mere tumble before him, but a terrible and resistless rebound, as if the powers he had porkily invoked took him by the scruff of his neck and threw him shouting out of sight of common humanity through the air. Not his Allah indeed, nor any of the bearded and irascible sub-deities of his theogony, Gabriel, Azrael, Eblis, but that boundless, tentacular, blind omnipotence whom no one has ever worshipped, on which none has ever dared to see a human face, who has never had the smallest idol made in his image, the collective weight of the past, the sum of all that has happened since the ether first trembled, the vast arithmetic of causality, which has its tides and currents like the ocean, and on whose crest this little gesticulating prophet was now carried in a resistless surge to the conquest of the world. For Mark, as we say more soberly, the time is ripe for Mahomet and his religion. Judaism is lost in an impalpable powder of angry, haughty exiles, shut up in ghettos of their own devising, preparing in universal misanthropy for universal martyrdom. Christianity is involved in the West in the endless task of getting the Frank, Aleman, Saxon, Celt to renounce murder and theft and fornication. In the East, it has lost itself completely in the paradox of power and riches. It is racked with 100 organic diseases of theology. The unaccountable but real impulse of its devotees to hate easier than to love is splitting every unity in the empire, even military and economic. But Christianity and Judaism have poisoned the natural religions of the vast area they have touched, from Gibraltar to Bombay. They have not converted the idolater, but they have made him skeptical and apologetic. The old gods are sick and sorry for themselves. At the other pole of the situation, Arabia is starving. So slowly, however, that its people are at the stage of hunger-anger and not hunger-weakness. We have noticed the trade factor. In addition, the climate has been drying for centuries. Already the fat plains of Babylon are deserted, the aqueducts choked with blown sand, the cities buried in mounds. The swarm instinct is among the Semites, as it came to Central Asia centuries before. It is struggling desperately with the myriad tribal jealousies, incompetencies, fears, like a new river trying to find its bed through a rock-littered ravine. History is piling up behind the loud little man, and he digs his heels in vain. Recapitulate what Mahomet has invented: a super-tribal unity, an arithmetical theology to replace the complicated and discredited tribal gods, a motive paradise, a driving fear, hell, prayers, an ethic which has all the elements men demand, even to a few of the food restrictions no religion can do without. He has removed the fear of death that hitherto balked the Arabian warrior, and he will soon sharpen their instinct for plunder tenfold by appointing it a duty. The lever of his position is now his own converts, his own past, the picked fanatics, who returned in haste from Abyssinia at the news of the compromise. It is too much to expect a religion to have kept count of what they said to the prophet. We must be content with the unusually candid chronicle of the bare events. The emigration, then Mahomet's compromise, 3 months afterwards the return, and then cancellation of the satanic verses by a new revelation, and the beginning of a new, fiercer stage of the struggle. Mahomet's peace was gone. Indignant Quraysh made a firm attempt to detach Abu Talib from his nephew, to uncover Mahomet from his clan. The old man, though still hostile to Islam, refused and went further. With chosen young bloods from his family, he went to the Kaaba, listened to the assembly, and then answered, turning to his following, "Uncover what you hold under your coats." They drew out their weapons and held them up. Then to Quraysh, "By Hobal and Allat and Manat, if you kill him, there will not remain one alive among you." Following on this success, Mahomet made two notable converts: Hamza, son of Abd al-Muttalib's old age, and a gigantic bully of the town, Omar. Quraysh, scared off bloodshed, declared a solemn boycott of the Islamites, and also of the whole clan of Hashim, unbelievers and believers, from Abu Talib to Mahomet. The ban was written, that they would not marry their women, nor give their own in marriage to them, nor sell anything to them, nor buy aught from them. An invisible wall henceforward separated their quarter from the life of the city. Mahomet himself, willy-nilly, urged on by a logical working outside himself, whose momentum increased with every development of events, now began on a new phase. Hitherto his message was for Mecca. Now he began to preach to the pilgrims at the fairs, especially to the Jewish traders. Wherever he stumped on this gospeling, he was followed by hostile Qurayshites, jeering and threatening. One especially, a squint-eyed man, fat, having flowing locks on both sides, and clothed in fine Aden stuff, dogged his steps, shouting out, "Believe him not, he is a lying renegade." This was his own uncle, shut up with him in the boycott, Abdallah Abu Lahab. Zo Abu.
The faithful were thus treated for the next 2 or 3 years, during which the doting Khadija died, AD 619, and also the good uncle Abu Talib, faithful both to Mahomet and his idols to the end. In this new stage, the Prophet showed great energy. He even journeyed as far as the next town, Al-Taif, to preach. The inhabitants threw dust on him and ignominiously expelled him. He had more success with the men from Medina, that rival of Mecca, 11 days' camel journey to the north. The Medina pilgrims were won over in considerable numbers. The Jews were very powerful and numerous in their city, and at this period extremely sympathetic to the man they regarded as a sort of unofficial convert. 12 of these Medina men, at the pilgrimage of AD 621, actually took the oath of blood alliance with the Prophet in great secrecy, which is called the Pledge of the Aqaba. This pledge is the next turning point of history. From here, Mahomet psychologically abandons Mecca and turns to every point of the Arabian horizon with the words, "Ye people, say, there is no God but God. Ye will be benefited thereby. Ye will gain the rule of all Arabia and of Al-Ajam, foreign lands, and when ye die, ye will live like kings in paradise." Quraysh, seeing a part of his new policy, though ignorant until the end of its full amplitude and success, increased their petty persecution. The faithful began to drift to Medina, each family departing by night and locking up the door of its house. But the extent of this persecution had been exaggerated. The worst thing recorded, which perhaps even has a certain humor, to my taste, is a deed of the indefatigable Abu Lahab, who climbed on the Prophet's roof with a goat's entrails in a bucket, which he threw down the chimney as the Prophet was preparing his meal. Mahomet rushed out, carrying the offense on a pointed stick and shouting, "What sort of a refined neighborhood is this?" But as the clandestine emigration proceeded, and quarter after quarter, street after street, emptied, his enemies advanced by degrees from curiosity, mystification, to an alarm all the more dangerous because none knew exactly what was afoot. The operation was carried on with all the rather sinister secrecy of an Eastern mutiny. The growing number of locked doors seemed like a creeping disease. The moment arrived when only Mahomet and Abu Bakr remained of the faithful in the hostile town, steadfastly going about their business and pretending that all was normal. Quraysh held a secret assembly. This time, there was a plan and no dissentients. A delegation from every clan were to call on the two and carefully and simultaneously plunge a knife into their chests, a round robin of revenge. A bizarre murmur warned Mahomet and Abu Bakr and made them speed up what they had planned long before, their own escape. A few lines must sum up the vast mythology that has grown up about this escape, which is the Great Hejira. The outline indeed is quite simple. Since the road to Medina was certain to be blocked, or on the direct line of pursuit, the two agreed to hide in the vicinity until the scent was cold. In his old excursions with Khadija, Mahomet had found a cave on the peak of Mount Thor, or Thawr, about an hour and a half from the town, and they settled on this for their retreat. In the evening they crept through a back window of Mahomet's house in a boycotted and now deserted quarter of the southern suburb and made their way there unobserved. Modern pilgrims assure us that the road they followed, which is now a very meritorious pilgrimage, is still excessively steep and disagreeable. In the early morning, the Vigilance Committee of Quraysh cautiously attacked the empty house and found the birds flown. Pickets mounted on fast camels were immediately sent out onto the Medina road, and armed bands beat all the country for miles around. Naturally, the fugitives were helped by angelic intervention. A spider made his web across the mouth of the cave. 2 wild pigeons made their nest in the entrance, etc. In any case, Quraysh never found them, and after 5 days the two came out, found camels that had been supplied by various complicities in the town, and set out by forced marches for Medina. The day of their flight, the Hejira, was 20th June, AD 622, and the beginning of the Islamic era. Mahomet was then 53 years old. Medina, the new epicenter of the adventure, was both larger and incomparably more habitable than the abandoned Mecca. It was in a fertile valley and surrounded by a belt of date palms and groves and gardens, to which even more than the caravan trade that passed through it equally with Mecca, it owed its fame and wealth. As Mahomet and Abu Bakr approached, they were met by hordes of rejoicing converts. The question of their lodging immediately arose and needed some tact to settle. Mahomet, with his unsleeping common sense, realized that there was a great danger of arousing jealousies at this critical moment. So the inspiration came to him to ask his camel, the celebrated Al-Qaswa, to decide for him. The mob of excited and wrangling faithful, it is remarkable that Mahomet never inspired fear, opened their midst to allow the beast to pass, and all in the silence which such an operation, half theological and half gaming, requires, followed. Al-Qaswa was leisurely. She ambled through the center of the crowded marketplace and down the principal streets, occasionally, as if teasing, hesitating to snuffle in some open gateway, but never stopping until she had clean gone through the town and come to a deserted part of the suburbs. There, with great premeditation, watched by the awestruck and baffled congregation, she nosed into the dusty and neglected courtyard of a derelict villa and squatted down. Arrangements were at once made for buying the place, which had long served as a yard for tying up camels, and on the spot thus divinely chosen was soon afterwards begun the first and most famous mosque of Islam, in whose purlieus Mahomet lived the rest of his life with his harem, and where he lies buried alongside the tombs of his first 2 successors, Caliph Abu Bakr and Caliph Omar. The history of Mahomet in this Medina phase has been obscured and ornamented with a unique mass of traditional detail, the least item in which is an immutable part of the Islamic code of morals, customs, and law. But though much of this hagiology is psychologically amusing, yet the unity of his character observable until the time of the satanic verses, and possibly even to the Hejira, is, though not changed, transposed into another key. In short, this Medina prophet
now behaves like an institution rather than a man. His adventure has become the majestic, inevitable unfolding of an historical logic in which, in everything but one, he is a mere instrument or proposition. That one thing is his taste for women, which he now indulged generously. Instead of Khadija, he now possessed, as the nucleus of a gracious party, the little Aisha, 12-year-old daughter of Abu Bakr, whose own testimony in her old age was that the Prophet liked three things most: women, scent, and eating, but mostly women. With quickening progression, he added new faces to his collection as the occasion offered. One of his principal sources of supply was the death of a follower and the acquisition of his widow. A feeling akin to gooseflesh comes over the explorer in the curious labyrinth of early Mohammedan history, when he realizes that the Jews, if they had wished, if, as Mahomet would have put it, they had had the sense, could have appropriated Islam. Mahomet, we have seen even in so condensed a sketch, was their pupil, their imitator, and in the beginning of his stay at Medina, almost their creature. It was the Bene Nadir, the Bene Ammar, and the rest of the rich, warlike, and politic Hebrews of Medina who opened the doors of his refuge to him, when his followers were too small in numbers and poor to have influenced the councils of the clan leaders. It was to Jerusalem, their holy city, that the Prophet and his faithful turned in prayer in these early days. And there still exists a document which is a definite overture of Mahomet to them for at least perpetual alliance. This venerable monument of a missed, or doubtless rejected opportunity provides for war and peace to be made in common, sets out that the Jewish clans are one people with the believers, assures, "Whosoever of the Jews follows us in our expeditions shall have aid and succor." Underlying all this is the definite candidature of Mahomet to the messiahship. It is probable that a certain part of the Jews supported him in this, and remonstrated with their co-religionists for waiting for any fulfillment of Isaiah better than this fervent monotheist, Talmudist, and testifier to the integrality of the Torah, much more likely than any Bar Kokhba to give them that military world power the realists required. The dispute, characteristically and astonishingly, between Mahomet and his supporters and the recalcitrant Jews of Medina turns, not on any lack of what we may call supernatural theatricality in his person, absence of any unusual atmospheric phenomena to support his claim, but whether or not the prophecies both appealed to applied to a son of David, as the Jews insisted, or to a mere son of Abraham, through Ishmael the first Arab, which none disputed Mahomet to be. The Davidists won, and the world was spared or deprived what would have been the greatest of those reunions of the Semitic race, which have illustrated some of the most brilliant pages of the history of civilization. Mahomet entered into a rage, then cooled to a vindictiveness that cost his rejectors dear. The symbol of this break is the sudden changes of the Qibla, or orientation of the mosque. The Prophet was leading the prayers of the faithful in what has received the name of the Mosque of Two Qiblas, near Medina, about 2 years after his arrival. He had already performed 2 prostrations with his face towards Jerusalem, when his anger mounted to his throat, and he suddenly swung round in the direction of Mecca and the Kaaba. All the worshippers imitated him at once, and ever since Judaism and Islam have parted their ways. At the same time, being at a loss as to a distinctive signal to call his followers to their prayers, bells being Christian, and the ram's horn roarer of the Jews which he had hitherto used, being also out of the question now, Mahomet bethought him of the far-reaching baritone of Bilal, the African, and commissioned him to mount in the minaret at dawn and chant the office of the first muezzin. "Prayer is better than sleep. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah," and so forth. Now Mahomet, by the use of every possible form of persuasion, perfidy, maneuver, and political sagacity, ended by establishing himself the undisputed master of Medina. With this power, he set about revenging himself on the Meccans. He attacked their caravans, even in the holy months of the truce, as they passed his stronghold, and divided the booty with his followers in the sacred proportion of 80-20. The incidents of this robbery under arms are surprisingly varied and dramatic. The storytellers of Arabia replenished their stock with them for 1,000 years. Hamza, Abu Bakr, Abu Sufyan, the idolatrous chief of Quraysh, Bilal, the big-voiced, the painted prophet always in the rear, inventing such battle cries as Ya Mansur Amit, ye conquerors strike. The timely interventions of Gabriel and his angelic host, as numerous as a nest of ants. These are some of the ingredients of the story that men still discuss round every campfire of Africa and West Asia. Mahomet showed an increasing greed for spoils and cruelty to his prisoners. Only the prettiest girls could be certain of mercy after the battle. The two principal affairs were those of Bedr and Ohod, the last being drawn. It led to an accusation of treachery against the Jews, and their piecemeal massacre and exile from Medina occupied spasmodically the years that followed. Not content with his revenge against those resident in the city now completely in his hands, Mahomet began his role of conquest by the invasion of neighboring Jewish settlements in the deserts. In one of these, Khaybar on the Syrian road, the faithful fought under the great black flag, the eagle, which was none other than the chemise of Aisha. After the victory, Mahomet sent Bilal to secure Sophia, the young Jewess, whose beauty was famous even to Medina, for his own prize. Bilal on purpose brought her back through the battlefield past the corpse of her father, in order that I might see her fright. In spite of this brutality, she willingly agreed to a place in his harem. But another Jewess, Zainab, was not so accommodating. She dressed a kid with dainty garnishing and, having steeped it in poison, placed the dish with fair words before Mahomet on his nuptial feast. Mahomet took a few mouthfuls and spat one out. His commentators vaguely feel that he should have known better. One of his guests ate more and died. Zainab was made over to his relatives to be tortured to death by them. The Prophet, according to his own complaint, never quite recovered from the effects of this poisoning, and is supposed to have died from it in the end. This is the meaning of the common charge against the Jews of having martyred him.
7 years after the Hejira, Mahomet made a truce with Quraysh and led his followers to the pilgrimage which had been his far-off starting post. The unbelievers abandoned the town to them and camped out on the hills to watch. At the head of 2,000 mounted pilgrims, shouting the ancient cry of this pilgrimage, Labbaik, Labbaik, the Prophet reached the Kaaba, touched the black stone reverentially with his staff. Although Hobal and his graven company were still standing in the cube, Bilal mounted the wall and sent up his call to prayer. After 3 days, the faithful locked up their houses again and went back to Mecca. The conquest of Mecca 2 years later was on the whole a tame affair. The forces of the Prophet had grown overwhelmingly greater than those of Quraysh. The home faction was sapped with sedition, and when Mahomet at last appeared, the place fell with hardly a blow. Abu Sufyan himself accepted the new faith. After making the 7 tours of the Kaaba, Mahomet pointed with his staff at each of the idols which had been taken out and stood along the wall for execution, Hobal towering above them. "Truth is come," he shouted, and a Negro with an axe hacked these ancient confidants of the secret prayers of old Arabia until they were utterly destroyed, screaming and sobbing, says the legend. The force that was driving him did not falter an instant at this triumph, once hardly dreamed of. It is carefully recorded that he re-established one of his uncles in the family privilege of selling water to pilgrims from Zemzem. But much more inward in his mood is the notion of announcing himself to the kings and princes of the earth. One of his followers suggested that such potentates accepted no communication that was not sealed, so Mahomet had a seal made for himself of silver, inscribed in the old Arabic character, Mahomet, the Apostle of God. With this, he sealed dispatches to the Emperor of Byzantium, the Emperor of Persia, the Governor of Egypt, the Satrap of Syria, announcing to them, the exact terms are lost, that God had again intervened in the affairs of men. These missives were carried by special emissaries from among his bodyguard. They probably arrived. That to Constantinople, they say, was lost in the labyrinthine intricacies of the government offices. That to Persia, torn in pieces. Even thus, O Lord, said Mahomet, rend his kingdom from him. That to Egypt brought a strange reply. 2 beautiful Coptic girl slaves as a present from the Roman governor. One, Miriam, gave Mahomet the joy and sorrow of his old age. A little fat son, Ibrahim, who had a whole flock of white goats set apart for his nourishment, and who died in infancy. But Mahomet the adventurer has been swallowed by his adventure, which is now openly independent of his personality. Out of a pilgrimage stunt, it is growing into an avalanche of destiny in which kings, peoples, whole civilizations and religions will be carried away into irreparable oblivion. Out of the mass of incoherent writings, cursings, distichs that he is still pouring out in his old age, half buried under the minutiae of new laws obviously inspired by the domestic bickerings of his harem, there is vaguely visible the plan to which the old man is arrived, the species of vast plunder gang, the bandit state, in which he will brigade all the faithful, the gigantic enterprise of organized looting of the whole world to which he calls his race. And they came. The new religion poured through the desert like smoke from a damped fire in a gale of wind. The men of the desert and the men of the ruined cities, hungry and lean, rushed to the black standard, or joined forces with the irresistible hordes he sent against them. Light of ear, bloody of hand, hogs in sloth, fox in stealth, wolf in greediness, dog in madness, lion in prey. The Arab was at last on the move. Every man shares in the plunder, said Mahomet. Those who are not there draw from the Prophet's fifth. Christians and Jews may not share. It is their punishment. They shall stay out of our expeditions and pay tribute. So when he died, June 632, Mahomet is no longer the motor, but the curiously carved and tinted figurehead of the adventure. He died in Aisha's arms, manfully insisting that everyone in the room should share his medicine, except his old uncle Al-Abbas. Let no one remain without being physicked, as ye have physicked me. He was succeeded by Abu Bakr, and he by Omar. 3 years after Mahomet's death, his followers had conquered Damascus. In another year, the Emperor of Byzantium withdrew from Syria. In another 5, Egypt and Persia were in their power. In the lifetime of a man who could have seen Mahomet as a boy, the borders of Islam were the Pyrenees on the one side, China on the other. Exactly 100 years after his death, the Moslem wave reached its furthest point at Tours in France, and but for the cavalry of Charles the Hammer, would have been the next year in England.